Sergeant Daniel Thompson stood near the airport entrance, holding a small black folder tightly in his hand. Inside it were papers, official ones, the kind that opened doors without many questions. But today wasn't like any other assignment. He wasn't heading out for training or deployment. Today, he was escorting someone home, a young Marine named Jason Reynolds, who had died in action overseas. The two men weren't just fellow servicemen. Daniel had known Jason since he was a boy. Jason grew up next door to Daniel's parents. He was the kind of kid who always waved, always asked questions about Daniel's army stories, and once said he wanted to be just like him. When Jason enlisted, Daniel wasn't surprised. He was proud. But now, years later, he was the one bringing him back, covered in a flag, silent, too young. It was early morning, still dark outside, and the airport was quiet. Most shops were closed. The only sounds were suitcase wheels rolling and distant announcements over the speakers. Daniel walked with a straight back, in his full dress uniform. His shoes clicked softly against the tile floor. He didn't look around. He was focused, respectful, calm. As he made his way through the terminal, a few travelers turned their heads. Some nodded silently. Others just stared, unsure what to say. There was something different about him. Something they could feel even if they didn't understand it. He wasn't a regular passenger. There was weight in his steps. At the airline check-in counter, Daniel handed over his documents. The clerk, a young woman with tired eyes, looked through the folder, then quickly straightened up. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice softer now. Daniel gave her a small nod. He didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for smiles. She gave him his boarding pass and pointed him toward the gate. "They'll meet you there," she added. He walked on, passing coffee stands and closed bookstores, thinking about Jason's family. His mom had cried when Daniel called. She said she trusted him to take care of her boy, even now. His dad didn't say much, just asked when they could see him. Daniel had escorted fallen soldiers before, but this was different. This was personal, and it mattered more than anything to do it right. As he neared the gate, he felt a small sense of relief. Everything so far had gone smoothly. The military transport had arrived on time. Customs hadn't given any trouble. He just needed to board the next flight, sit near the cargo hold, and stay with Jason until they landed in Ohio. But what Daniel didn't know was that the real challenge hadn't started yet. And it was waiting for him, right at the gate. Daniel reached the gate and stood quietly to the side. The terminal was still calm, but more passengers were starting to show up. A few glanced at him and then looked away, unsure if they should say something or not. His uniform said everything. It told a story without words. He waited patiently, holding his orders in one hand and a small carry-on in the other. After a few minutes, a woman in a navy blue blazer walked over. She looked like she was in charge. Her name tag said Susan. She gave him a quick glance, then looked down at his paperwork. "Sergeant Thompson?" she asked. "Yes, Mom," he replied. She didn't smile. Instead, she looked over the documents again, then frowned. "I'm afraid there's been a change in airline policy," she said. "Escorts are no longer allowed to travel on the same flight as the remains." Daniel blinked, thinking maybe he misheard. "I'm sorry," he asked. "We've had to adjust our handling of military transports," she continued, speaking quickly. "The casket will be flown on this flight, but you'll need to take the next available one. You'll meet the remains at the destination." Daniel shook his head slowly. "That's not how this works," he said calmly. "I'm the escort. I stay with him the entire time. I have clearance to fly with him." Susan didn't look up. "I understand, but this is airline policy now." He could feel the tightness in his chest. He had dealt with difficult situations before, but this one felt wrong in a different way. The thought of Jason's body flying alone, while he sat in another plane or waited in another city, it didn't sit right with him. He took a breath and tried again. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this isn't just any cargo. This is a fallen soldier. and I gave my word to his parents that I would bring him home. I understand, she said, though her tone didn't match her words. But I can't make exceptions. You'll have to take it up with the station manager. By now, a few people nearby had started to notice. A man holding a coffee paused mid-sip. An older woman leaned slightly closer. Someone pulled out a phone and started recording quietly. Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to draw attention. Then let's speak to the station manager, he said. Susan gave a stiff nod and walked off, phone already in hand. Daniel stayed put. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, hands at his side, waiting. He had one job, to bring Jason home with honor. And he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. The minutes felt like hours as Daniel stood there, quietly watching Susan walk off. The terminal buzzed with the low hum of conversations, the clinking of coffee cups, and the rolling of suitcases, but none of it mattered to him. In that moment, the only thing that mattered was making sure Jason's body was treated with the respect it deserved. A few more passengers came and went, looking at him curiously but not saying anything. He didn't mind. It wasn't about them. It was about Jason, his friend, his neighbor, the boy he'd watched grow up. A few minutes later, Susan returned, this time with a man in a gray suit who had a serious look on his face. He didn't introduce himself right away, but Daniel could tell this was the station manager. The man looked at Daniel for a moment, then at the papers in his hand. Sergeant Thompson, I'm David Gray, the station manager, he said, holding out his hand. Daniel shook his hand firmly, keeping his expression calm. I'm sure you're aware of the situation, he said quietly. Yes, I am, David replied. I've reviewed the policy change and I understand your concern. But unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. The airline has made it clear. Military escorts must travel on a separate flight. It's their new procedure. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. Sir, with all due respect, that's not how it's supposed to work. I'm the escort. I stay with the body. It's not just about policy. It's about doing what's right. David paused, clearly weighing his words. He glanced around at the small crowd that had gathered nearby, sensing the tension in the air. Someone in the crowd murmured, he should be with the soldier. Another person, an older man, nodded in agreement. Daniel could hear their whispers, and it made him stand a little straighter. I understand your commitment to your duty, Sergeant, David said slowly. But our hands are tied here. This is beyond me. Daniel looked around again. More people were watching now, some with their phones out, recording the entire scene. He didn't mind being in the spotlight. He wasn't here for attention. He was here for Jason. Sir, Daniel said, his voice calm but firm, you don't understand. I gave my word to this young man's family. I promised them I would be with him. You can't break that. David shifted uncomfortably. The crowd's attention was growing, and he knew the situation was escalating. I'll have to check with corporate, he muttered, looking down at his phone. Daniel didn't say anything. He simply waited, keeping his posture straight, his eyes fixed on the manager. He didn't need to speak again. The people around him were already speaking for him. Within minutes, the situation was becoming more than just a disagreement between one soldier and an airline policy. It was becoming a matter of honor, of respect, and of what was right. And Daniel wasn't about to let anyone forget that. The tension in the air was thick as Daniel stood silently, watching David check his phone. The few passengers who were nearby had stopped what they were doing, watching the exchange unfold with growing interest. It was clear this wasn't just a minor issue anymore. Whispers began to spread. Some were asking what was going on. Others were simply shaking their heads. Daniel didn't care about the crowd. He didn't care about the cameras. His focus was on one thing only, keeping his promise to Jason's family. After what felt like a long pause, David finally put his phone down and looked at Daniel with a deep sigh. I've contacted corporate, he said, his voice lower now. They're going to have to give the final word on this, but it's going to take time. Daniel nodded, though his patience was running thin. "How long?" he asked, trying to keep his voice even. "It could be a while," David said, his face showing a hint of frustration. "They're based in another city, and they're not going to give us an answer right away. But I'm doing what I can." The crowd around them had grown larger now. More people were noticing. An older woman in the group spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. "He should be with the soldier. That's what's right." Daniel glanced at her, grateful for the support, but didn't say anything. It wasn't about him getting praise. It was about doing what was right for Jason. "We're not asking for a special favor," Daniel said, his voice strong. "We're asking for the proper respect. The honor of the military escort isn't just a formality. It's a responsibility. I'm not leaving this airport without ensuring Jason gets home the right way." David shifted uncomfortably again, clearly feeling the weight of the situation. The manager was clearly stuck between following orders and recognizing that there was something more important than policy at play here. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. People were starting to speak up in support of Daniel, the mood turning from quiet curiosity to open disagreement with the airline's policy. A middle-aged man with a beard spoke up, his voice firm. "You're not going to send that boy home like cargo, are you?" His words were simple, but they carried weight, and everyone listening understood exactly what he meant. David looked at the man and then at the crowd. The pressure was mounting. He glanced at Daniel, then back down at his phone, likely checking for any new updates from corporate. But as the minutes ticked by, it was clear the situation was only getting worse. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone. Daniel wasn't just fighting for a seat on a plane. He was fighting for what was right. "Listen," David said finally, breaking the silence. "I'll do everything I can to make this right. Just give me a few more minutes." Daniel said nothing, only nodded. He wasn't going anywhere. Jason wasn't going anywhere. And neither was he. The minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity as Daniel stood there, his eyes never leaving David. The quiet buzz of the terminal now seemed distant. The voices around him were a blur. It was as if the entire world had faded away, and it was just him, standing in defense of a promise. People were still watching, some whispering to each other, others recording on their phones. The scene had caught attention, and it wasn't just the small crowd near the gate anymore. More passengers had gathered, sensing the tension. There was something about the situation that made them stop in their tracks, something that told them this wasn't an ordinary travel delay. "Sergeant," David said, breaking the silence, "I've spoken to corporate. They're not happy about the situation. They're insisting that the new policy stands." But he paused, glancing at the crowd. "I'm hearing you. And I know this isn't just about rules. It's about respect." Daniel nodded slowly, not saying anything. He didn't need to say much. David's words, though hesitant, were a small victory. At least the manager was starting to understand. But understanding wasn't enough. Not yet. Then, without warning, a voice cut through the tension. "Let him go with the soldier." It was an older man, dressed in a casual jacket, but there was a certain sharpness in his tone that got everyone's attention. He wasn't part of the growing crowd at the gate, but his words rang out clear and strong. He walked up to Daniel, his eyes focused on the station manager. "I'm a veteran," the man continued, looking at David. "Served in the Air Force, and I know damn well that no soldier should be left alone like that. Not like this." The crowd shifted, murmurs of agreement rippling through the group. Daniel glanced at the man, who was now standing beside him, unwavering. "You've got a soldier here, a boy who gave everything for his country," the veteran continued, his voice rising slightly. "And you're telling me that he should be treated like luggage. That's wrong." David, visibly uncomfortable, didn't respond right away. He simply looked down, maybe searching for the right words or perhaps realizing that the pressure from the crowd was no longer something he could ignore. Daniel's gaze didn't leave the veteran. He didn't need to say anything to him. The man understood. He didn't need to explain why he was standing here, Why this fight mattered. It was obvious. As the voices grew louder, Daniel felt something shift. It wasn't just him anymore. It wasn't just about the uniform or the policy. It was about the collective respect everyone in that airport now shared. They weren't going to let this stand. David hesitated, looking back at the crowd, then back at Daniel. The moment seemed to hang in the air, stretched and fragile. Finally, he sighed. "All right," he said, almost reluctantly. "We'll make an exception. The escort can travel with the remains." The crowd exhaled in relief. Daniel didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He just gave a small nod, his heart finally feeling the weight lift. But he wasn't done yet. Jason was going home, and no one was going to stop him. The airline staff moved quickly after that. Something about the crowd's reaction had shifted everything. The tone, the energy, it was all different now. People started to go back to their seats, but they kept looking over at Daniel, some giving him quiet nods, others offering small smiles. Nobody needed to say it out loud. They all understood. Susan returned to the gate with a new boarding pass in her hand. She handed it to Daniel without a word, her face serious, but softer now. "You're confirmed on the flight, Sergeant," she said. "You'll be seated near the front. The cargo team has been informed. The casket will be loaded with care." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." He didn't need anything more from her. Her voice was calmer this time, maybe even respectful. She walked away, and Daniel finally allowed himself a breath. As he waited near the boarding area, the older veteran who had spoken up earlier approached him again. He extended his hand. "Name's Bill," he said. "You did the right thing, son." Daniel shook his hand firmly. "Thank you, sir. And thanks for standing up." Bill gave a small chuckle. "We've got to look out for each other, especially for those who can't speak for themselves anymore." They stood there in silence for a moment. Daniel looked out the window. The sun was starting to set, casting a soft orange glow on the runway. Somewhere out there, Jason's casket was being carefully placed on the plane. Not cargo, not forgotten, but honored. Boarding was called a few minutes later. The gate agent gave Daniel a quick look, almost like she recognized how important this moment was. No one rushed him. No one made a sound as he walked through the gate. He entered the plane and found his seat. A flight attendant approached him quietly, her voice low. "We've made arrangements with the captain," she said. "He knows you're on board as an escort. If you need anything during the flight, just let us know." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." The plane filled slowly. Passengers were calm, maybe still thinking about what they'd witnessed at the gate. Some looked at Daniel with quiet respect. Others simply gave him space. He appreciated both. As the plane pushed back from the gate and began to taxi, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of Jason's family. He thought of Jason himself, young, brave, and gone too soon. This wasn't the journey they had imagined, but Daniel had done everything he could to make it right. The engines roared to life. The plane lifted off. And just like that, they were flying home. Together. The plane was flying smoothly through the night sky. Daniel leaned back in his seat, but he didn't feel like resting. His mind was too full. The hum of the engines and the dim cabin lights gave everything a quiet, almost dreamlike feeling. He looked out the window again. It was dark outside, just tiny dots of light from towns far below. He wondered if Jason's hometown was one of them. Somewhere down there, a family was waiting to welcome their son back home. They didn't know yet about the trouble at the airport, and Daniel hoped they never would. They deserved peace, not more stress. The captain made a soft announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're currently flying over Kansas. We'll begin our descent in about 45 minutes. Thank you for flying with us." Daniel nodded to himself. They were getting closer. Soon, he would be walking beside Jason again, this time through the final part of the journey. A flight attendant walked by and paused beside his seat. "We'll let you off first once we land," she said gently. "The casket will be taken off right after." There will be an honor guard at the airport. Daniel appreciated her calm voice and respectful tone. She didn't treat this like a regular flight. She understood what it meant. He gave her a small nod. "Thank you," he said quietly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small photograph. It was of him and Jason, taken during training. They were both covered in mud, smiling like kids who had just finished playing in the rain. Daniel stared at the photo for a while, remembering that day, remembering Jason's laugh. "We made it, buddy," he whispered to the picture. "Almost home." As the plane started its descent, the lights of the city below became clearer. Daniel felt the plane slow down, and the familiar feeling of landing filled his chest. But this landing was different. It wasn't a return from deployment or a vacation. This was a homecoming filled with honor and sorrow. As the wheels touched the runway, Daniel's heart beat faster. Not from nerves, but from the weight of the moment. He looked out the window and saw military vehicles near the cargo area. The honor guard was already there, waiting with perfect posture, dressed in full uniform. Once the plane stopped, the captain made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, on board with us tonight is a soldier escorting a fallen hero. We ask that you remain seated for a moment of silence as he exits the aircraft." The cabin fell completely silent. Not a single sound. Even the babies stayed quiet. Daniel stood up slowly and walked toward the front of the plane. Every eye was on him, but it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like respect. He stepped out into the cool night air. Jason was right behind him. And they were home. The plane landed just after midnight. The lights on the runway were soft and steady, and everything moved slower than usual, like the world knew something important was happening. Daniel stayed seated while others gathered their bags and shuffled toward the exit. A flight attendant came over and quietly said, "You'll be escorted down once everyone is off. The honor guard is waiting." He nodded and stayed in his seat, hands resting on his lap. His heart was heavy, but calm. He had done what he came to do. Once the cabin was empty, Daniel stood and followed the attendant to the door. She gave him a gentle look before stepping aside. The cool air from outside hit him as he stepped onto the tarmac. The lights from the airport shimmered, but the area near the cargo hold was quiet and still. There in the distance stood the honor guard, 4 soldiers in uniform, standing tall and perfectly still. Beside them was a black van and Jason's family, his mother, father, and sister. They looked tired but full of love. His mom clutched a folded flag against her chest. Daniel walked over slowly, each step heavy with meaning. When the cargo doors opened and the casket was brought out, everything around them went silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. The flag-draped casket came down with care, guided by the honor guard. Daniel stepped forward, joining them. He had trained for this moment, but it felt different now, real and personal. He kept his movements steady, every step in sync with the others. As they walked the short distance to the van, Daniel didn't look around. His eyes stayed forward, focused, not on the cameras nearby, not on the people watching in silence, but on Jason. When they reached the family, Daniel stepped back as the guard lifted the casket into the van. Jason's mother stepped forward, her eyes red but clear. She looked at Daniel and whispered, "Thank you for bringing my son home." Daniel nodded. He wasn't alone, ma'am, not for a second. She reached out and took his hand for a moment. No more words were needed. The van door closed with a soft thud, and the honor guard saluted. Daniel stood beside them, his hand raised in one final proud goodbye. As the van pulled away slowly into the night, Daniel felt the weight of everything settle in his chest. Sadness, honor, grief, and peace. He had kept his promise. He turned and began walking back toward the terminal, the lights behind him glowing softly. He wasn't a hero. He was just a soldier who did the right thing when it mattered most. And somewhere above, maybe Jason was smiling, knowing he was never forgotten.